Hi everyone and welcome to Deep Geek. This is the fourth in a series of videos that I am doing with the wonderful Gemma from Secrets of the Citadel. Gemma, do you want to say hi?
Hi, absolute pleasure as always to be on your channel, Robert. You know I love your work and what you do, and we keep saying this, but we're both in England, so it's just so wonderful we can arrange times together to do these collaborations. I hope these continue for the foreseeable. There's so much to talk about beyond season 8, so I'm sure we will continue collaborating in the future.
We definitely will. Guys, if you haven't done so before, then please do go and check out Secrets of the Citadel. One of the reasons why we decided to do this was because we thought the kinds of people that I know watch my videos will definitely like Gemma's videos because they're excellent. And the kind of people who like Gemma's videos may well like mine too. So we thought it's that kind of crossover there that if we can introduce you to the other person's work, then that's absolutely fantastic. Just by way of introduction here, this, as I say, it's the fourth in a series that we're doing. I'm not sure if we've come up with a cool name for the series, but it's something like really intriguing second-tier houses that we think might have some kind of mystery or secret about them.
That's quite a long title. That's like a working title, right?
That's a working title for the time being, but it means that we get to cover things like House Mormont, House Hightower. We did House Dayne last time, and this time we're looking at House Reed. The kinds of houses that you look at and think, yeah, there's something going on there. Not entirely sure what. There's definitely something going on that we don't know about. And when we were talking about House Dayne last time, we kept on just leading across into starting to talk about House Reed, and we had to hold ourselves back because there is so much here. Why don't we just start though, Gemma? Could you just give us a sort of a hotted? What are the crannogmen? We know about House Reed; they come from the neck. What does this mean to be one of the crannogmen? What is that?
A crannogman, yeah. When I mean, the way they're described, they almost come across as like a separate species. You know, in any house, you'll get dark-haired people, you'll get lighter-haired people, you'll get tall people, short people, but this seems to be quite across the board. There's a very specific look for the crannogmen. They're very small people. They live in the swamps and the marshes of the neck. They're incredibly reclusive. They're very mysterious. We see very little of them. And I'm not talking about just in the story as a whole. I mean, Westeros in general see very little of the crannogmen. They're not massively well liked. I mean, I think tactically what they do for the North is very highly respected, especially by the principal families, the other principal families in the North, because House Reed are a principal family, but they're kind of quite, I wouldn't say poor, but they live on different terms. They don't have these huge great castles and keeps, and I'm not even sure if they have a maester. They kind of have their own set of rules and they kind of keep to themselves and do their own thing. But I mean, tactically speaking, they are the North's first line of defense. You know, where they are geographically, it's a key location. And without House Reed and the crannogmen in general, the entire North would be potentially vulnerable from attacks from the south, because the neck serves as a stranglehold for the North. But yeah, they're called mudmen and frog eaters. They have kind of guerrilla tactics in the way they fight. It's not like a big army or anything. It's very stealthy and from the shadows of the trees. They certainly work with their environment. They're a very earthy kind of people. They know the land and they use it to their advantage, and they live off that land. They literally wear clothing made from the land. Like I said, super reclusive, very, very mysterious. Interesting possibilities for ancestry, which is speculation because we don't have any ancestry. I mean, you asked me before we started, do the Reeds appear in any way, shape or form on my family tree that I've created? And the answer is no, they don't. There is no known connection to the Reeds to any other house in Westeros.
Yeah, I think that is a great introduction. I think that's a fascinating thing, is that all of these kind of houses, and even right down to a lot of the smaller houses, there are mentions of them somewhere. They've had some notable person who did something in Fire and Blood or the World of Ice and Fire, a hero or a character or a king or something. House Reed, there's nothing. It's literally silence. We know that they, after the Marsh Kings, who were apparently the first among equals in the Neck, that House Reed became the paramount house there in the Neck. We don't know whether there's any connection between them and the Marsh Kings before that. We don't know any members of the family at all for thousands of years until we get to Howland Reed. He's the first time that they just kind of emerge out into this wider world. So when we're talking mysterious, we're talking really mysterious. We do not know. We've been told nothing other than... Sorry, go on, Gemma.
No, absolutely, because this is again because we do chat about this before we sort of hit the button, and then we realize we need to hit the button because we've already started to go. We were looking at, if you look up on the wiki, for example, and there's always a section. If you look at a particular house, there's always a section towards the bottom which will list historical figures. If you look up House Martell or House Stark, there'll be a list of these legendary figures from the days of dawn, from the Age of Heroes. There is none for House Reed, literally none. They do not feature in the Dance of the Dragons. There is no mention of a particular Reed having any kind of role or doing anything during any of the Targaryen era. There's no Reed in the Age of Heroes. There's literally nothing, and that in itself really stands out.
It does. So all we know is that they are one of these crannogmen families. They're the preeminent one. I think we will come back to this quite a few times, I think, but the link to the Children of the Forest is strong. Apparently, when the Children of the Forest were casting the Hammer of the Waters, then they did it from one of the towers in Moat Cailin. There's lots of rumours and history of them working together and obviously, as you say, intermarrying, and they are noticeably different in stature to other First Men families. So there's something going on there. There are hints to them about magic. We'll come on to Howland Reed in a bit, but they're treated with this kind of like mixture between awe and repulsion, really, by everyone else, and just like a bit of disdain. They're not seen as civilized. They still live this hand-to-mouth kind of culture where they're catching their own food, frogs, and they've got their tridents and their nets and all the rest in a completely different way to the rest of Westeros, which has moved on to this sort of cultivated farmland and agrarian kind of economy and things like that, where there's trading and all the rest of it. They don't. They stay in where they are. And there's one road that goes through, and you don't step off of the road because otherwise you'll die, because there's 1,000,001 ways to die in a swamp. Yes. So no one ever comes into contact with them. They just hide out there and they never come out and see anyone. So it is so mysterious, added to which we get this idea that no one even knows where Greywater Watch, the castle of House Reed, is, because it moves around in the marsh. It's not a land-based castle. It's on I forget the word for it, but it's like a sort of a floating island, effectively, and it moves around. And even the ravens don't know where to find it, so they can't contact it. So they are completely cut off.
But they've done it themselves. That yes. is completely through choice. And Meera says some very strange things about how they she says that in I think it's in Storm, she says that Howland grew up hunting and fishing and climbing trees, which is, all sounds pretty reasonable, but then she adds, and learning the magic of the crannogmen, which is like, what is this? But there's no explanation for what said magic is. I mean, of course, we have plenty to go off, especially when it comes to Jojen and Howland with the Isle of Faces. Like you said, you mentioned the Children of the Forest, and there's certainly echoes running through not just House Reed, but all of the crannogmen. You know, they're kind of like children of the forest, aren't they?
Well, they are. And when Bran asks about Howland, Meera says, yeah, whether he had green dreams like Jojen. Meera says, no, he could breathe mud and run on leaves and change earth to water and water to earth with no more than a whispered word. He could talk to trees and weave words and make castles appear and disappear. Now, this is poetic language. This sounds very much the kind of language which is used of the children of the forest. Talking to trees clearly has a link across to the Weirwood network. And then muds and leaves and earth and water, and that these are all the kinds of things that the children of the forest's magic seems to be about with their hammer of the waters and things like that. Is so the links are very clearly there. Whatever magic Howland and the crannogmen know, it is highly connected in with the old gods and with the children of the forest and the Weirwood network.
Yeah, we have like fire magic with R'hllor, and whether that's glamoured or not, you know, we've seen aspects of both sides of that. And then we've got the White Walkers with their ice. The crannogmen and the children of the forest seem to be very much the magic of the earth, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've started talking about him already. So let's move on to the most ancient member of House Reed that we could possibly name, which is Howland Reed, which, as we've already said, is pretty crazy that we don't know any of the ancient members of House Reed. Howland Reed emerges from the neck, and he goes to the Isle of Faces, which again is a stupidly exceptional thing because we've only ever heard of two people successfully going there, and one of them dropped in on a dragon. So the fact that this little guy could sort of like get his coracle boat and paddle his way up to there, normally the kind of earthy magic seems to blow boats away and pick up storms and birds attacking people who try and land there and all the rest of it. So the fact that he got there clearly, again, underlines this idea that he has got this kind of link across to the children of the forest and the Weirwood network that seems to be based at the Isle of Faces.
And he stayed there for a full winter. You know, this wasn't just a brief stop off. He stayed here for a substantial amount of time.
He does, and a full winter in that instance counts, I think, as 2 or 3 years. That winter
yes,
after 2 or 3 years, so it's not a matter of months. Yeah, this is and then I want to throw. I've got 1,000,001 Howland Reed theories that I'm going to throw some of them at you as we go. The next curious thing that seems to happen is the false spring, when everybody, including the Maesters, are convinced that winter has ended, and then they all celebrate. They come out from wherever they are. The tourney at Harrenhal is arranged. Everyone descends down there. Howland appears. Things happen. We'll come on to it in a second. Things happen at the tourney at Harrenhal. And then the moment that's finished, winter comes back, as if it had been arranged for there to be a break in winter so that tourney at Harrenhal could happen.
Yes.
Do you think, or how likely do you think it is that Howland had some part in that?
Yeah, I mean that's quite a grandiose claim, isn't it? To be able to control the weather, but the weather in Westeros is not as we understand weather at all. And there's clearly something magical going on with the seasons and the weather. And yes, the weather suddenly becomes warmer. Everybody thinks, hooray, winter's ending, spring has begun, but it hadn't. And this was so much of an anomaly that it was given a name, the year of the false spring. From what we can glean, this doesn't generally happen. The Maesters do their utmost to track as best they can these crazy seasons and how long they last. And they as we know, they distribute ravens to indicate certain seasons and what have you. But what we can gather is that a false spring is clearly anomalous enough to be given a specific name. We know that Howland Reed his intention was to seek out the green men, and this is the Order, who's entrusted with guardianship of the Isle of Faces. Old Nan, the way she describes them is very much Cold Hands-esque, riding elks with antlers and things like that. And they are just as enigmatic. We know very, very little about them. But there's so much magic interwoven, and magic of the earth, which we said before, is something that is connected with weather patterns. And it does feel that the tourney of Harrenhal had to happen for many reasons. It was such a pivotal event. I mean, so many almost destined, like fated meetings between certain characters that had to happen, certain revelations that changed. I mean, we're looking at Southern Ambitions at the moment. Myself and JR and Kyle and Lauren are behind the scenes researching this for a 2-part live stream we're doing. And, we've got this whole setup, this whole conspiracy of the grandparents of the current lords trying to, sort of this overthrow of House Targaryen was being sort of plotted behind the scenes, or so it seems. And then the tourney of Harrenhal kind of spoiled everything. It certainly threw several spanners in the works, but it wasn't just Rhaegar. It was the Ashara was involved. Howland Reed was massively involved. Lyanna was involved. King Aerys was involved. There was a lot of components there, and it does feel like the tourney of Harrenhal was very much a destined thing. I'm not sure if Howland Reed is literally manipulating the weather personally, but think about the Hammer of the Waters and the magic of the Children of the Forest. He could well have found somebody else who had a power to do something along those lines.
Yeah. There's a lot there. I mean, as I'm sure I've said before, I tend to the view of if in doubt, blame Bloodraven. And when I say Howland, I think this is shorthand here for the Weirwood Network and Bloodraven as well. So I think that it feels to me like he came there, he learned, he grew, he took his orders, and then he went out and they created a window for him to go out for a tourney which happened absolutely coincidentally on the shores of the lake that he was in the middle of.
That's right. Yes.
So it seems very coincidental.
Convenient.
Very absolutely very convenient. So it all works out there, and we then take the idea of what might happen, what might have happened at Harrenhal. George R. R. Martin, I always have to kind of preface this, was George R. R. Martin has said, when he's been asked about what happened, he said, so much happened at the tourney at Harrenhal, I could write a book about it, and a George R. R. Martin book at that. So
wow.
he's saying that there is so many, I mean, there's 7, 8, maybe 1,800, maybe 1,000 pages worth of stuff that he could write about what happened just over that, nearly 2 weeks or whatever it was.
Yeah.
So we're just scratching the surface with the things that we know. But what we do know is that there was this curious incident about the Night of the Laughing Tree that that Howland was definitely involved at the start of, and may well have had some other kind of influence on in some way. What's your take then of the story that we have of him being this kind of guy who gets beaten up, and then Lyanna takes his side, and then we get the Night of the Laughing Tree trying to right some wrongs and get some vengeance and all the rest of it. How do you see your Howland's role within that?
Well, I think it's fishy. Because, I mean, we're told that these squires were like no older than 15 years old or something. And I mean, and I appreciate Howland Reed as a small man, and this is 3 against 1. But from all accounts, Howland was able to hold himself against 3 members of the Kingsguard at the Tower of Joy. It feels like he wasn't really fighting. Like this was an opportunity, because of course this gave Lyanna the opportunity to step in, and it was through Lyanna Stark that Howland was then introduced to the Starks, and they struck off this amazing connection and friendship immediately, to the extent where Howland was kind of like Ned's right-hand guy at the Tower of Joy. Well, he literally was. So they certainly struck up a friendship very, very quickly. I know that the Reeds were the Stark's bannermen, and that's what Lyanna said. You know, these are my father's bannermen, and she beat off these squires who were, you know, roughing him up a bit, from what we can gather. And then we get this whole story about, like you said, the Night of the Laughing Tree. A lot of people, I think the most popular theory goes is that the Night of the Laughing Tree was Lyanna, and that when Rhaegar went off to find the Night of the Laughing Tree, as Aerys had commanded him to, and came back saying that I didn't find him, that he actually found Lyanna, and that's when they fell in love. That's the dominant theory. But you know, the descriptions of the Night of the Laughing Tree, that could have easily been Howland Reed too. Which one do you, I mean, if you had to go, if I had to put money on it, I'd say Lyanna, but I cannot dismiss the possibility, although I'm not sure how that would have served Howland. I think ultimately you have to look at who's gaining what here. And Howland gains a very fortuitous friendship with the members, the sons of House Stark throughout this incident. And that very much worked either in his favor or towards an agenda that he was pursuing.
Yeah, I think I am completely sold on the idea that this was Lyanna. I think it fits in with her. I think it fits in with the story. I completely agree that this was Rhaegar hunted down the Night of the Laughing Tree and found her. This works for me in a slightly more meta-narrative as to why on earth did he give her that crown, because she was the undefeated knight of the tourney. And it wasn't just a show of love and affection, because he will have known this will have annoyed people. It's because he set this up for him to be, you know, the person who won the tourney. Perhaps he did win it of his own right. Perhaps he got some of his Kingsguard to throw one of the tilts to allow him to go. We don't know. That's a little bit of speculation, but we certainly know that people didn't tend to fight their best when they were against the Crown Prince. That was just, we see that again and again in the Dunk and Egg stories, and later with Robert Baratheon we see. So at the back of his mind, at the very least, he might not have thought that he was the worthy champion. But if he knew that there was someone who had fought 3 knights and beaten them all, then he would have potentially have given that person the victor's laurels, so to speak. So that makes a lot more sense to me than just oh, I really fancy this person, therefore I'm going to try and give her some roses and hope that she likes me back. That doesn't work for me on a deep level.
In front of her betrothed and my wife, and there has to be a prior context to what Rhaegar did in that moment. That's, you know, because that was a fairly risky maneuver, and you know, from what we understand, Rhaegar wasn't an idiot.
No, so absolutely not.
This is either, again, an agenda or some kind of insane infatuation, which must be based on some kind of communication or contact previously, surely.
Yes, and to bring this back to Howland, we have to then take the fact that he started all this.
He did.
So it was him. He mysteriously arrives right at the exact moment to be there. He gets beaten up right at the exact moment for Lyanna to see that he gets beaten up. He is there while they're having conversations. Her and Benjen are having conversations about how do we restore the honor of your family, and you're one of my father's bannermen and all the rest of it. And Benjen's there being like eager pup saying, hey, I can find some armor. I can find a horse. So that then led to the meeting of Lyanna and Rhaegar, and that, many people believe, is what is the start of this kind of manipulation to try and get Jon conceived, is to actually push these people together.
This pact of ice and fire, and this goes way back, the concept of a pact of ice and fire that that someone behind the scenes is trying desperately to get House Stark and House Targaryen to conceive a child. This goes back to Cregan Stark. This is not a recent thing, and it does feel, I've looked into this kind of blood pact, and it feels that somebody behind the scenes has been trying to achieve what was achieved with Jon Snow for some time, decades, maybe even a century or two.
Yeah, I agree. It's been going on for a long time, and this is the last video I'm going to be doing in my series on Robert's Rebellion, the Tower of Joy, is going to be trying to pick up what is the influence. We're going to talk about it a lot today in this video, but what is the influence of Howland and Bloodraven and the Weirwood Network all the way through this period? Where might they have been pushing things in the way that they want? And this connection between House Stark and House Targaryen certainly seems to be something that they've been trying to manufacture. Can we get on then to the second bit? Because we sort of teased this in the last video. If you saw it, the one with House Daynes, this link between Ashara and Howland.
Yes.
So I think what I'll do, I did a whole video on this if you want to look for it, but I'll just give like the 1 minute overview of this. But it's one of my favorite theories, because when you first hear it, if you don't know any of the context, you think what, Howland, Reed and Ashara Dayne got together? How's that even possible? That just sounds like you've picked two random names out. But there's a lot to this. And the first point is to say Meera Reed clearly has a mother. She was born around the same time. So Howland Reed did meet the mother of his children at some point around then. So
Meera's the same age as Jon.
Exactly.
I mean, not necessarily to the day, but yes, certainly but roughly, to the year.
Yeah, exactly. And there's this, so it's sometime around this period. Definitely, there was Meera was born, and therefore Howland was in a relationship with somebody.
Which means Meera was potentially conceived while Howland Reed was not in Greywater Watch.
Exactly. Yeah. So we know where he is at the beginning of the war, or just before it, the turning at Harrenhal. We know where he is at the end of the war, Storm's End, heading down to the Tower of Joy. It's the bit in the middle where we're not 100% sure on, but we shouldn't assume that he went back to Greywater Watch. We've got no information on him. It seems to have come out for a reason to be doing stuff. But there's this fantastic bit where you get Meera and Jojen, who are telling Bran effectively about the tower, about the tourney at Harrenhal.
Yeah.
And they're telling the story that they say their father told them this story lots of times, and they couldn't believe that Bran hadn't ever heard this story. And the story is told about, and it's in a curious style. It's in the curious style of all the characters within it are given these little nicknames, sort of based upon their house or their sigil or whatever. So you get the young pup was Benjen, and we get the white sword being Arthur Dayne and things like this. The only two characters who aren't given those nicknames are the lad, who is Howland, it would appear, his character who's referred to as the lad, and the maiden, who is Ashara Dayne.
Yeah.
Now, so immediately we're being told structurally that this is actually not a story about what is going on in this tourney. This is a story about these two people. And the only character out of all of this that we get any kind of description of is Ashara Dayne. And then actually we're told, her eye color, what her hair was like, every single person she danced with that night, huge amounts of detail, as if Howland was just like logging all of this information. And so at the very least, he was paying her a huge amount of attention in a kind of having a massive crush way. But then when you add in the fact that we know sometime around here that, or the two facts, firstly, that at some point around here, he met or got into a relationship with Meera's mother. And secondly, this was a story he told again and again and again to his children. This starts to give the hint of it being How I Met Your Mother story.
Yes, because that's what parents do, don't they? They reminisce to their children how we got together, and they paint this love story, you know, especially if they are very much in love, and you know, you're our children. And yeah, I can completely see that, because and interestingly, these are all details that Bran was never privy to, that Ned did not relay. The majority of what we glean in this text about the tourney of Harrenhal is from Jaime and Meera.
Yeah, and so if we're saying that this is the story that was told to the children, if we think that Ashara is not their mother, then actually what's happened is that Howland Reed has been telling his kids again and again and again a story of, well, just before I met your mum, there was this really hot woman who was, and let me tell you exactly who she danced with. Her eyes were so beautiful. It doesn't work for me. It only works for me if this is a story of how he met the woman who's the mother of his children.
Yes, it's inappropriate to say the least in any other context, surely.
And so once you get this as a kernel of an idea, actually things start to drop into place, because we get the idea that, yes, Meera was born sometime around there. That kind of works. There's some kind of language stuff that Barristan Selmy uses, which is absolutely fascinating, when he compares once Dany to Ashara Dayne, because their eyes are quite similar. And then he thinks about one of the suitors for her, Quentin Martell, and he says, no, a mud man doesn't need that. She deserves much better than that. And that is exactly what happened in this theory with Ashara and Howland, was that she went for a mudman, but nobody would believe it. He thinks that Ashara got dishonored when she was there, which is probably his prudish way of saying that she slept with somebody. Clearly wasn't Ned Stark, because he had a huge amount of respect for Ned Stark. Who was it? I don't know. But whatever happened afterwards, she then looked to Stark. And who would you look to if you were trying to get some kind of support for your relationship with a crannogmen? The family, who are the only family who actually support and like the Reeds. So it kind of starts to make sense. Then you get, and I'm going off on a rant here, but you get that.
This is fascinating.
My two favorite incidental details of this one, right at the very end, because my theory is that perhaps then they went off together up to Greywater Watch. We know that Howland's wife, the mother of Meera and Jojen, is called Gianna, which is what you would get. George loves doing name play. What you would get if you take Lyanna and the J from John and push them together. So if you were creating a new made-up name, having faked your own death, that might be what you would do. But then the other thing which I find fascinating, we know very little about them, about the crannogmen or their culture or anything like that. So we just have to assume that their culture is default to most of the North. But what we find out when in the books Meera and Jojen go up to pay their respects to the new Lord of Winterfell, they are introduced as the Lady Meera and her brother Jojen, which very clearly says that she is the heir. She is being introduced first, because you would introduce, here's the important person and somebody else, a hanger-on.
Which is a Dornish thing, right?
Exactly. So you have to ask, where on earth might this family, who've never, ever gone out beyond their own little area, got this strangely Dornish custom that it is the eldest child, regardless of their gender, who inherits? It makes sense to me if they got that from a Dornish person marrying into the family. So it's not something which is absolutely set in stone, but it just makes sense of so many little details if that's the case.
It makes a lot more sense of House Dayne's apparent love for Ned Stark. Just, you know, the tradition, the standard story that we understand is that Ned killed Arthur, and then Ashara committed suicide because of Ned, and that doesn't gel with House Dayne, you know, embracing Ned to the extent where they literally name their heir after him. Everything points to Ned doing them as a solid at some point. And if, you know, Ashara was completely in love with Howland, and they had a child together, but things got complicated because of Robert's rebellion, and then John was born, and they figured out a way, and Ned was prepared to bend over backwards to accommodate this relationship and to make it happen and to tell lies, basically, to cover things up that needed covering up. Then that makes a lot more sense that House Dayne would appreciate what Ned had done for them.
Exactly, and it provides the link, the tie between the Danes and the Reeds that we were starting to hint at in the last video, is that it's not just that they happen to have been around at the same sort of time, but there might well have been a family tie going in there, which incidentally adds another layer to that enigmatic phrase that Ned Stark comes up with, if it weren't for Howland Reed, then Arthur Dayne would kill me. Is that actually, what if Howland Reed was Arthur Dayne's brother-in-law at that point?
Yeah.
That suddenly adds a whole extra layer to what was going on there, because stopping him is not just about stabbing him in the back. There are a million ways that he could have prevented his brother-in-law from killing his liege lord. So there's another layer of potentially hints about what might have gone on at the Tower of Joy.
I mean, we get a lot of this, like you said, from Barristan Selmy, that Ashara was dishonoured. She looked to Stark. But prior to all of this, it's very much established that Howland is staying with the Starks. So to see Ashara sneaking into a Stark tent could well have been her sneaking into a Reed tent.
Yes.
On one of those nights.
Well, we're specifically told, the only bit of sleeping arrangements that we're told is that Howland stayed in Ned's tent. That's the only bit of information we have. Then we get when Harwin, who was one of the people who worked with the Starks and was at the tourney at Harrenhal and therefore knows the rumours, he's talking to Arya. And he just does this throwaway line when she quizzes him about Ashara Dayne and her father. And he says, so what if there was some whispers in a tent or perhaps something more in a tent at Harrenhal? And it's like, oh, so the rumour was about a tent.
Yes. About
Ashara Dayne being in Ned's tent. Actually, nobody would think that she was there for Howland Reed, but it's the same tent. So you can certainly see how a rumor could have started, and yet actually maybe she was there visiting Howland Reed, and that is where she got dishonored, in Barristan Selmy's words. So it all just like kind of adds up when you start thinking about it. Why tell us about which tent Howland was in unless it was actually an important detail?
I think the reason why we've got this purposeful mislead is through it's the interpretation of the characters. Like you said, none of them would believe that Ashara would go for a crannogmen. We established at the very beginning of this discussion that people don't necessarily like the crannogmen. They're not well respected in certain degrees. Ashara, she danced with Oberyn Martell, Lord John Connington. She danced with Brandon, and then she danced with Eddard. You know, these are men of renowned knights and princes and, you know, huge noble houses. So there's this, she's absolutely beautiful, this beautiful woman dancing with princes and lords and knights. And so the concept that she had fallen for a crannogman is not something that would have even crossed Sir Barristan Selmy's mind. It's an assumption that she would have gone for somebody a bit more highborn, a bit more noble, you know?
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think that this is very much where George R.R. Martin comes from with a lot of this, is that it's the people you're not expecting who actually you need to start keeping an eye out for. And you would not expect Ashara Dayne, this famed beauty, to be going for Howland Reed. But, you know, why not? Why not? It's entirely up to her who she falls in love with. There's no evidence of her falling in love with anyone else.
That's right.
So let's go with that one. And there's no reason to believe that she didn't become pregnant. So it all kind of ties together. But let's finish off on the Howland thing, because I want to talk briefly about the two children, Meera and Jojen. But just in terms of Howland, so whoever you think he may have gone with, Howland ends up going back up to Greywater Watch at the end of Robert's Rebellion and stays there. Do you think we will see Howland Reed again?
In the books, yes. I don't think we'll get a point of view chapter from him, but he certainly will be making an appearance in the books. In the show, it feels that they have skirted around the necessity for Howland Reed at this point. While we were relying on Bran's vision alone of the Tower of Joy and his understanding of Jon's parentage, that was still in question, because I did wonder, to how reliable are people going to take the word of Bran, who now apparently has visions. But then they, of course, added Sam into this equation with written records from the Citadel. So it feels as though the show has figured out a way to maneuver around introducing Howland Reed. But in the books, 100% we will see Howland Reed, probably with Mage Mormont and Galbert Glover. And yeah, he has to show, and I highly anticipate his arrival, as I know everybody does. And I think he's going to blow this whole thing open. And I think that, of course, this is why he hasn't so far. He clearly knows too much. And this is the ace up George R.R. Martin's sleeve. And if I was an author, I would be hanging on to that one for as long as I could get away with it.
Yeah, I think on the show, they've taken a lot of his reveals and given them to Bran and Sam. So they don't need Howland Reed. He might make a cameo, but I don't think he's going to be in any way an important part in season 8. But yes, I completely agree. He will turn up in the books, probably in A Dream of Spring, probably with Mage Mormont just suddenly appearing up there in Winterfell after it's been liberated and the Starks have it once more. I think that's roughly where we're going to end up with this.
Yeah. But yeah, and in which case the final reveal will kind of happen at the same time, because the show's obviously skipped forward substantially. The Starks now have Winterfell back. The battle for the Dawn is poised. So I think it will happen sort of timing wise around in a very different way. Obviously in the show it's going to be Bran and Sam, and in the books it will be Howland, but it'll be around the same point in time.
Yeah. So let's move on to the other reads that we have, which are Meera and Jojen.
Yes.
Now, they got sent up to, in the books, they got sent by their father. So Howland sent them. So we have to again think of them as being part of this big plan. They got sent up to effectively swear their fealty to the new lord. After Ned had died, they came up and swore their fealty to Robb. It was to Bran because Robb wasn't there, but they did that. They have this wonderful pledge, which I shall just quickly read out because
it's beautiful and very enlightening.
Yeah, and so it's to Winterfell we pledge the faith of Greywater. Hearth and heart and harvest we yield up to you, my lord. Our swords and spears and arrows are yours to command. Grant mercy to our weak, help to our helpless, and justice to all, and we shall never fail you. I swear it by earth and water. I swear it by bronze and iron. We swear it by ice and fire. And this is particularly that last line. The first few lines sound very ancient and Children of the Foresty, but the last line, ice and fire, obviously just immediately springs to mind, because the amount of times that actually we hear this phrase ice and fire in the Song of Ice and Fire is quite limited. So we have to
actually the first time the phrase is used as well in the text throughout. It's mentioned, like you said, very few and far between. I think Sam says ice and fire at one point, Aemon does, but the first time ice and fire is used together is here in that speech that you just told us.
Yeah. So I think this is a hint that they are in on this grand plan that they've been sent up. The extent to which they are, I do not know. But well, I should put it to you then, Gemma. How with the grand plan of Bloodraven and Howland Reed and all the rest of it, how up with it are those two characters on their way up to Bloodraven?
Well, I mean, Meera seems to, well, both of them do, Jojen and Meera. They certainly know a lot about the tourney of Harrenhal. And it's kind of like Bran has these snippets that his father has told us. And then, like I said earlier on, we get a lot from Jamie as well about the tourney of Harrenhal, but obviously in the context of his personal experiences of what happened. But the vast majority of what we've discussed here, this Night of the Laughing Tree and Howland Reed's role in particular, all comes from Meera. There's certainly a lot of information. And this is where, again, her mother becomes very notable in her absence, because Meera's very forthcoming. She talks a lot about her father. She gives away many details. She doesn't strike me as somebody who's withholding anything particularly, which leads me to the conclusion that she actually is talking about her mother more than we understand. She just hasn't, George R. R. Martin's been very clever to make sure that she doesn't directly say, "Oh, and my mother," because obviously he's keeping that one under wraps. But, if she's talking about her father that much, then it makes sense that she would talk about her mother that much. The only reason we know Diana's name is because it appears in the appendix. It's never mentioned at all. But yeah, I don't feel that Meera is withholding anything. I think for her safety or for her protection, herself and Jojen have been given by Howland as much information as they need to know at that point. Jojen, on the other hand, he's of course different, because he's privy to green sight and green dreams and things that other people will not see. It feels that it was Jojen's green sight that led Howland to send them in the first place. I mean, his only two children, and sending them off on such a mission that they're young. This is a very precarious time. Robb Stark's ridden off to war. This is a risky thing to do, to send your only two children. Howland Reed didn't need to do that. Their appearance was a complete surprise to everyone at Winterfell. So there's clearly something very, this is like a very serious mission. They needed to get Bran to Bloodraven ultimately. And I think Howland knew that. Whether Jojen did or not, he probably did in some kind of ambiguous way through visions and what have you. But you have to remember that the children, Meera, I think, is very much there in the capacity of Jojen's protector. She's very capable of handling herself. She takes on Summer at one point, and beats him, as kind of. She tangles him up in her net. So yeah, I can't. Meera doesn't come across as withholding information. Jojen, he's a lot more kind of vague and poetic about the way he talks, and you have to kind of get deeper into his words to pull and extrapolate bits, and this is a lot of theories come from his words.
Yeah, so I think I would agree with pretty much all of that. I think so. Meera is clearly she's the leader and the protector, but Jojen seems to, the further north they get, the sort of the heavier a heart he seems to have, and he seems to be having this idea that he's going up and he's going to be sacrificing himself by doing this. And Meera quite often kind of tries to gear him up and say, it's not all that bad. Maybe this isn't going to happen. And he's, oh yes, it's definitely, I know my fate and things like that.
Yeah.
So I think that he is absolutely bought into this in some way, because he sees himself as doing a thing in order to die for the furtherance of the cause.
It's nothing short of depression that he falls into towards the end of the series as it stands. he's resigned, isn't he? And
Yeah.
it's quite sad to watch his kind of deterioration, because he starts off fairly jovial, and he has a complete character reverse.
He does, and but he never tries to fight it. He seems to just sort of accept this is what's happening.
Yeah, resigned to it completely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there is a theory that I subscribe to, and I'd be interested, I think you do too, that his fate is not just to die in a kind of like a vague sacrificing his way for Bran way, but in order to be made a part of what we sometimes call Jojen paste, in order to free up Bran's mind to truly access the Weirwood network. He is fed this what looks like it's tree sap from Weirwood trees, but there are bits swimming in around it that look a little bit more sort of inside of human, so to speak. It's all rather gruesome and grisly. We know the Weirwood networks operate on very much a sacrifice basis. Do you agree? Is this Jojen? Has he been killed or sacrificed or given up part of himself to allow Bran to become a Greenseer?
Like you said, Jojen is clearly aware of his fate, and he's not even trying to fight it. I do agree with the Jojen paste. I do think Bran ate his friend inadvertently, which is horrifically macabre. The only thing that kind of goes against this potential idea is that Jojen explains to Meera that his fate is back at Greywater Watch, and that when he returns home, there will be unpleasant consequences for him. But there is very much a feeling that this is Jojen kind of trying to give Meera a bit of hope that they're going to make it out of this. This could be because, like you said, Meera retains this kind of hopefulness throughout, and she's trying to maintain like a positive attitude despite Jojen's clear deterioration into depression and resignation. So maybe at some point he just said, oh yeah, well, when we return home you'll understand, and she's misinterpreted it as Jojen's coming home with them because that's something that she needs to hold on to. But there's certainly towards the end of Dance, there are many things. I mean, Jojen weirdly goes missing. And I actually think that last Bran chapter, I can't remember the exact quotation or how it goes. It's been a while since I've read that one. But I think just as Bran finishes the paste, he realizes. And that's when it's like, and end scene. And we've never heard from Bran again because we don't have the Winds of Winter yet. But I think there is a moment that suggests, and I'll see if I can pull it up, but there's a moment that suggests Bran has suddenly clicked and realized what's happened. Like he hears a cry, or he has like a thought. Like I said, I can't remember the exact thing, but I remember thinking, oh, he knows.
I mean, I will talk for about a minute and see if you get a chance to quickly find that. So I agree. I think he has in some way sacrificed himself, Jojen, which adds an extra layer of tragedy because he knew that was going to happen and he always had the opportunity to escape it. But it's almost as if he has the conscious understanding that he is going to die to help Bran in the same way that Hodor seems to have, certainly on the show, and we will happen in the same, roughly the same kind of way in the books. Is that so? We've got this group of people who are going north with Bran, two of whom are there just to get Bran where he needs to be and powerful and back out again, and that is a huge sign that Bran is very important. He's not just going up there to learn a little bit of tree magic and then to come back down and say some spooky things to Littlefinger. There is more to his story than just that. So I think we're in agreement then that the two Reed children go up to Bloodraven's cave, and then Meera on her own with Bran comes back down south.
And that
Now,
was clearly always the plan, wasn't it?
I think that always was the plan. Did you pick up on that while I was saying? Did you
Kind
find the
of.
thing you're looking?
Find the exact quote. There is an amazing website that I'm sure you're aware of called A Search of Ice and Fire, and I get a lot of my quotes from there, and I do a lot of research in there. It's brilliant. And I couldn't pinpoint an exact keyword for it, but what we know is that when Bran is fed the weirwood paste, it immediately awakens his green seeing gifts, and then he enters the weirwood roots and searches for Ned, his father. This is when he tries to speak to Ned, and Ned hears the whisper. And the reason why Bran does this is because he's grief stricken. And now there's no, it doesn't explain why he's grief stricken. You know, he's just been given a really powerful gift. What would lead him to be grief stricken? And that's the hint. I think that Bran now understands what the paste was and why his green seeing has been awoken in that way. He's grief stricken, so he reaches out to his father.
Yeah, I think that's a really good spot. So, yeah, an idea that he understands what has happened, and this is going to be a part of the growing up for Bran, is the understanding of what is going on, because he's just a child going up there, and slowly he's going to start appreciating actually the magnitude of what is happening around him.
Throughout Bran's stories, especially with his warging escapades, there is so much foreshadowing of Bran eating human flesh. It's almost insane how much foreshadowing we get of that, you know, to the point where he's salivating over the thought of it as when he's in summer, and then they have conversations that you probably shouldn't do that, you know, that's not a good thing. And so yeah, that foreshadowing comes into play over and over again. This is we haven't kind of just Jojen and paste isn't just plucked out of thin air for a gross sake, you know. There's certainly plenty of evidence in the text leading up to that point that hints towards this being the case.
Yes, I agree. So let's move on to Meera then, the last member of House Reed that we've not really covered. She will then be coming down with Bran. I think in the books, as almost certainly won't be exactly the same way as on the show, but she and Bran will be returning down the south. I think that there is every chance that she will carry with her Dark Sister.
Yes.
Now, this, for those who don't know, this is one of the two House Targaryen family swords, Valyrian steel swords, that Bloodraven took it up to the wall. It's not at the wall, so the only implication is that he took it with him when he went up to range north of the wall, and it still has it with him. And in the show, there is and they do this a lot. I've talked about it before, when they kind of like pause for a moment over something that is like a nod to the community, to the book readers, to say this is an important thing. We're not going to cover it in much detail here, but just so you know that we know it's happening, is that we see a whole load of swords and things propped up against the wall, and Meera, as she's running past, grabs one of them. And I think that is a hint that she is going to take Dark Sister from Bloodraven's cave and then bring it back down south.
Yeah,
do you
absolutely.
like that thought?
Yeah, I'm 100% on board. Like you said, I love these little book nods that we get throughout the show. It's just enough to kind of tip the hat to the book readers without confusing the story, because obviously they have to keep it fairly tight for many reasons. And that was certainly a nod. A lot of people wanted to see Dark Sister in the show. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it would really fulfill any wider role in the context of the show, but in the books certainly. And I do believe, like you said, it was a hat tipping. It was a nod. I think Meera, exactly what you've said. She's going to return with Bran, and she will be in the possession of Dark Sister, the sword that was originally wielded by Visenya Targaryen, older wife of Aegon the Conqueror.
Yeah, so we've got this position then that Meera's coming back down south. I think that she will. So on the show, she's headed back down to Greywater Watch, which
Yeah.
seemed like a slightly bizarre move on the show, if you're thinking that maybe the Army of the Dead might be coming at you quite soon. But I think that means that in the books, then she might also be heading back. So, and let's not forget, she is the last remaining member, as far as we're aware, the last remaining member of House Reed. So, if the family is to survive, it will be through her.
It was a very ignominious, anticlimactic. If that is indeed the end to Meera Reed's story in the show, it was like, wow, Bran, that's cold. You know, that was a tough one for me.
But I thought that was quite effective, though, because
it was effective, but it was it was tough, wasn't it? It was just like, wow, that's cold, you know, and it did a lot for, you know, to show who Bran has become and who he no longer is. There's even romantic inflections, especially in the books, between Bran and Meera. At one point, Bran has a really horrendous thought that crosses his mind where he thinks he might be falling in love with Meera, and then he considers entering Hodor's mind so he can comfort Meera, which is horrific.
Yeah,
But,
he's quite morally dodgy, let's put it that way, when it comes to what he might do with Hodor.
Yes, we'll go with dodgy. God, George R. R. Martin's, wow. But yeah, so in Game of Thrones twisted way, there is kind of like romantic overtones between Bran and Meera. Not so much in the show, I don't think, but then to see this cold turn away, and I think it's quite possible, you know, when Bran really gets into his own, that we'll see a similar cut off of that relationship, and it will be cruel and hard and
it will.
cold.
So let's round this off by looking at the future then.
Okay.
What do you make of it? So we've got all these moving parts. We've talked a little bit about how Howland might appear again, about how Meera will probably in the books follow roughly the same path that she seemed to have followed on the show. Do you think that this is it? Do you think it's simply a matter now? Howland has to tell everybody the stuff that he's going to tell stuff, and Meera will just like pass into the neck and fade away, or something like that. It's just what's your take? Is this, are they like House Dayne with their moment has passed and now they're just going to they're done, or is there something else there in the future for them?
I think specifically for Howland, as the house as a whole, possibly not so much. I think it's quite possible that Meera's story is verging on being done. Essentially, her arc kind of feels at least moving towards a completion, whereas Howland, of course, is this in-universe ghost. And he has this information that could literally crack the entire narrative of the story open. I would like to believe that Howland's role will be more than just the bringer of the revelations. You know, a lot of people say he's been a no-show, he's been very inactive, where in actual fact, what's been going on in the neck would suggest this is really not the case. What's been going on with Moat Cailin and the Boltons and the Greyjoys, it feels very much that the Reeds and the crannogmen as a whole have been carrying out Robb Stark's orders. They have been very instrumental in the War of the Five Kings. We just haven't seen them. It's different tactics. As I said, it's guerrilla tactics that they use, so it's not as overt. So I think we've spoken about, you know, this neck being a stranglehold. It's such a strategic location. Now, Howland Reed coming in, telling the truth, yeah, Jon, Lyanna, Rhaegar, blah, 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 that's all great. But ultimately, what's coming for them is Winter, the others. And if they breach the wall, which they have to, in my opinion, because you don't build a 700-foot wall without the intention of bringing it down, in literary terms. And then they get past Winterfell, which I'm not 100% sure they can or they will. That's another matter. But say they did. ultimately they keep going south, they have to hit the neck. And historically, nobody's got past the neck ever.
Well, not from the south. So it's built as a defensive structure to defend against people attacking from the south rather than the north.
Does that work both ways? I mean, nobody's really tried to go from the north to the south through the neck, and obviously the neck is owned by the north, so they have a degree of control and safe passage. But is the neck going to become a strategic location as far as the others are concerned, or will they just freeze over the swamps and casually stroll over?
Well, I think if they get there, and I think they will, because I think they're heading to the Isle of Faces in the book.
Yes, exactly.
Then I think that, yes, they can do. Moat Cailin was once an amazing defensive structure, but particularly since the North has been brought into the Seven Kingdoms, successive Stark lords have kind of like left it be, and it has sunk down into the marshes there, and there's now really only 3 towers left.
Yes.
You can go through. It's just the problem is that those 3 towers, they cover each other, and it's just you would lose so many people just trying to get through. It's just not worth it. So it's still a good defensive structure, but it's nowhere near what it used to be.
The book kind of stops in the neck, doesn't it, ultimately?
Yeah, exactly.
So there's every reason to think that if the others got as far as the neck, which and like you said, I think ultimately their goal is the Isle of Faces, so they have to get through the neck. There's every reason to assume that the crannogmen will at least attempt to defend the location, as they always have throughout history, and thus far very successfully. This is another kettle of fish, though, isn't it? The others bring with them skills that they've never encountered before, so it could just be like I said, a freeze over and a walk over, and the crannogmen could find themselves running just as much as everybody else in the north.
Yes, and it opens up the possibility of zombie lizard lions, which is the lizard lion is something exactly as you think it might be, which is in the neck. Apparently, it seems to be largely just in the neck. They are huge alligator type things that seem to be able to run very fast, and so yeah, to add to all of these giant ice spiders and polar bears and all the rest of it, if we have some lizard lions as well, I think that would work just perfectly.
Because of course, as they proceed north, their numbers will build, won't they? And it always occurred to me that they would increase their numbers as far as whites go, like humanoid whites. But yeah, the concept of this army of ice zombies and whites and polar bears and ice spiders and now lizard lions, and yeah, this is getting a little bit Lord of the Rings, isn't it?
Well, it is, but if they make it that far south, then it's going to be a massive army. Let's put it that way, and it would need some massive magic to stop them. I'm going to wrap this up here. I think we've covered off. I can confidently say all of House Reed, all 4 members we know of, and we've had a little look at the future. I think that's quite an important point. Is that if the army of the dead does come down towards the sort of the Riverlands, the Isle of Faces, then that we're going to see the crannogmen in action in some way. But are there any final thoughts you want to leave us with about House Reed?
I think we've pretty much covered it. I think there are possibly a lot more connections with Bloodraven than we've been able to fully explore. I mean, I think the connections between Howland Reed and Bloodraven are clear. I think it's clear there's a connection, rather, but the full extent of that is not massively apparent. But it feels as though that there must have been some kind of communication or contact in some way, shape, or through the Weirwoods or whatever, because this feels like a joint mission that the children were sent on, Bran, Meera, and Jojen, from Howland to get them to Bloodraven. I think we could probably do an entire video, a discussion on Bloodraven, and if we did, Howland Reed would come into that equation several times over.
Yeah, I think for me, there's the clear link seems to be that Bloodraven finds Bran. Bran passes the initial magic test of can you fly, rather than falling on all the spikes on the ground.
Yep.
And then he talks to Howland, and Howland because Howland is Bloodraven's man on the ground in Westeros.
Yes.
Go off and do this and all the rest of it. And Howland is like, well, this time I'll send my kids. And they so Jojen gets this vision of what he decides in the end is Bran, but he doesn't know it's Bran to start with. He is merely looking for a winged wolf chained to the ground. That is what he is looking for, which is the kind of the image of someone that you might get in a Green Dream. So they are sent up there to find this person that Bran himself does not know exactly who it is he's got in contact with at Winterfell, and they are heading up there, and I'm sure they're going there. That Howland, who's got lots of experience in this, says that a winged wolf, that sounds like a magic using Stark.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, I actually think we should look at Bloodraven in some depth at some point. I think that's something for the future, and I think it would a lot of what we've covered today would certainly come into play there.
Awesome. Let's definitely do that. The other side of season 8, say. Yes. Okay, guys, I'm gonna wrap this one up now. Gemma, do you want to remind everyone who you are, where people can find you?
Yeah, I'm Secrets of the Citadel on YouTube. All the social media, it's quite easy to find me. It's Secrets of the Citadel. Just thanks for having me on. If you liked what you heard, go and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate that. It helps. Like this video, all the above, you know how it works. It does help content creators to do all of that jazz. I'm just really happy that we've been able to have these discussions. I love just shooting away and sort of pulling at these threads and seeing where it takes us. I know both of us have very minimal preparation for these. We just kind of go on an exploration together, don't we? And it always leads to some fascinating conclusions.
I just have to say, I think Gemma and my understanding of minimal preparation is slightly different. She admitted after before the Hightower one, she had 3,000 words of notes that she'd prepared for this one, which I didn't. I did my research, but slightly less than that, I have to say.
That's minimal preparation.
Minimal preparation. Guys, I know I appreciate Gemma's minimal preparation, and I know that you do too. I would highly recommend you go and check out Secrets of the Citadel. It's one of the best Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire channels out there. Doesn't just deal with the hype, actually just gets into the detail of the text in particular. I think I said last time, I highly recommend the Unraveling the Text series, which goes through chapter by chapter, just breaking down exactly what's happening in Game of Thrones and now halfway through A Clash of Kings.
Thank you.
An absolute pleasure having you on, as always. Guys, thank you so much for this. There will be another one of these on Gemma's channel in few days, a week or two, and then after that there's going to be one more on my channel, and then other side of season 8, and I'm sure we'll come up with some other things to be talking about. So guys, thank you so much. Thank you, Gemma, for coming on, and I will see you all again soon.